This is Jordan Youkilis, and you're listening to the Matt Balaker podcast.
Hello, everyone, and thank you once again for tuning in to the Matt Balaker podcast. It makes me feel so warm and fuzzy. And please like, subscribe, share, encourage your friends, people you don't talk to anymore. Make sure they subscribe as well. It feeds the algorithm, and that also makes me happy. I'm really excited for today's guest because he's not only a proud Ohioan and a podcaster, he's a Wells Scholar at Indiana University. He had a successful career in leverage finance and private equity, and then dropped it to start a cannabis fund. So join me in welcoming Mr. Jordan Youkilis. How you doing, Jordan?
Doing great. Thanks, Matt. Really excited to join you for the podcast today.
Me too. So, we touched on it a moment ago. You had a successful career in finance, and then you pivoted to start a cannabis fund. What were you thinking?
Just thinking that, I was sick of the smooth sailing, easy life and, really wanted to sail some rough waters. No, I think I've always had that entrepreneurial drive in me. As I progressed in my career, knew at some point I either wanted to go to get my MBA or to start a business. And as I progressed in my career, as you mentioned, from LevFin to private equity, I kind of felt that the value of the MBA was eroded in the sense that I was already kind of making the career progression that I would have hoped to get through that MBA experience. And so thankfully, I'd kind of planned for that from day one to save up some money to, make one of those two big leaps. And so,
wait, so time out. You saved money before a planned expense.
Exactly.
And I think you're a millennial. Like I'm a little bit older than you. I rarely do that. Where did you learn such fiscal responsibility?
Yeah, definitely from my parents. That's one of the things that they've ingrained in me from day one. They both grew up, with parents who'd grown up during the Great Depression, very frugal. They both had multiple kids, and so we're used to living on a budget. And so I think that was really firmly ingrained in them. And they were definitely more on the lower end of the risk spectrum in terms of their career progression, right? My mom spent her entire career as an art teacher. My father, his entire career at Procter & Gamble. Okay. So I think they really emphasized to me that the importance of not outspending your means and of, being protective with your capital.
Well, you have an artistic mother and a father who's at one of the most established companies and most recognizable brands in the world. And you're sort of the embodiment of the two. I mean, I see a guitar in the background. What sort of artistic pursuits have you gone on?
It's funny because my mom is more focused on like metalwork and photography and that type of artwork, which has just never been a strong suit for me. But music has always been something that I've really loved and been passionate about. And I actually, I never really got into it too much until the pandemic hit, at which point I realized, why not really take a stab on learning how to play it and not just listen to it. So I've loved getting into guitar over the last couple of years.
Nice. Well, guitar and cannabis, they're kind of a match made in heaven, but I want to understand. So you're working at GE, and I want to learn more about GE in a moment, but
sure.
There's probably a point where you told your mom and dad, I'm not in private equity anymore. I'm going into cannabis. What was their reaction?
It's really funny you say that. When I had the idea and first told my mom, her immediate response was, "What will I tell my friends?"
What a good mom. I love it.
Yeah. But it's funny, right? Because this was back in 2017. And that really did have an impact on me, right? Like you think about the stigma of the cannabis industry and how it's still stigmatized and viewed as almost like a less than type investment sector. And so it really took me some time to get over that and be like, well, you know what? As I've learned more about the history of the war on drugs, the Controlled Substances Act, and the history of cannabis, illegality, it really had nothing to do ever with the efficacy of the plant or its medicinal properties. It was all driven by political and economic motivations. So getting over that hump really helped me. And I think in a lot of ways, I'm thankful for that stigma, in the sense that I think it's helped to keep a lot of other traditional Silicon Valley folks out of the industry, even though these guys like to think of themselves as these innovators and cutting edge. In a lot of ways, I think they often fall into groupthink, like many other sectors do as well. And so recognizing that the stigma was actually nonsense in the first place, getting over that hump, and then saying, let's actually do something about it. Let's bring some real capital to this industry.
You're a rebel with a college degree. I like that, Jordan. So your parents obviously were on board, or enough to where, it didn't prevent you from moving forward. But when I was in business school, I had a corporate finance professor who would always point to GE in any example. That was kind of like the go-to case study, if you will, of a firm that has pretty easy access to capital, has been around forever, it's part of the Dow 30, I believe. What was the reality? What was it really like working at a company with such a big name?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was there, I was at GE Antares Capital, which was the leveraged finance group. They've subsequently sold that off to CPP, the Canadian Pension Plan. But yeah, when I was there, it was really valuable for a number of reasons. So Antares was acquired through a series of acquisitions. So even though it was part of the broader GE platform, it still felt very entrepreneurial. The team was fantastic. I loved working there so much. The CEO at the time, John Martin, we've been really blessed to have now as an advisory board member at Key. So I have loved maintaining that relationship with him. So you really got the benefit of this entrepreneurial backdrop, but because GE was such a massive business and they had not just the capital part of the business, but also the industrial side, they were able to borrow capital at a very cheap cost. So that was obviously very helpful in the leverage finance space, especially in traditional private equity, where capital is much more of a commodity.
Okay. And so you're at GE, and then you transitioned to Partners Group. Mm-hmm. Can you share what Partners Group does and what you did there?
Yeah, absolutely. So like I said, loved Antares, but wanted to make the move from the debt side of transactions to the private equity side of things. And so I moved over to Partners Group, which it's funny, it's probably one of the largest private equity funds that most Americans have never heard of. And a lot of that's because they're a Swiss-based firm. A lot of their history has been in Europe. But at this point, I believe they have over 125 billion assets under management across the globe. When I joined them, they were really ramping up their North American presence. And so I started with them on their private equity secondaries team in New York and then San Francisco. And then back in 2016, they opened up a Denver office, which is now their North American headquarters. And so I moved to Denver and transitioned to the private equity directs team at that time.
So you were already in Colorado before you made the leap to cannabis. Exactly. And so no, I'm really impressed, Jordan, because it takes such courage. You went from GE, a very stable firm, to a very stable private equity firm. And typically private equity jobs are not known for their stability. It's exciting. They tend to pay well, but you very easily could have stayed there, had a great career. You probably could have multiple Mercedes, and you could put them on Instagram and your parents would be proud. You circulate them around, but you didn't. Why?
Yeah, I think a couple things. So for one, as I mentioned, always wanted to be more entrepreneurial. For me, the money has never been the driving factor, right? What I've always really, I'd say, looked for is the freedom from that constraint of always considering, where's my next paycheck going to come from, mm-hmm. and to really be able to live the lifestyle that I wanted to have, and also to really feel like I was making a difference, right? And, don't get me wrong, loved my time at Partners Group, learned so much. But one of the things I came to recognize at that firm was that in the landscape for upper middle market private equity in particular, and Partners Group is very much focused on buying high quality growing assets, right? And so we're competing against the KKRs, the Blackstones of the world, and started to recognize that I think there's limited value for a lot of these businesses being acquired by private equity firms at this point in time, right? A lot of times they're already owned by another private equity firm. And so all you're doing is taking 6 to 12 months of management time through this very long, arduous transaction process, paying a bunch of money to lawyers and bankers, and the winning firm is based entirely on price, right? What was so exciting about cannabis and what convinced myself and my 2 colleagues from Partners Group to split off and form Key was the fact that the capital dynamics are completely flipped in cannabis, right? There's almost no institutional capital, despite the fact that all the regulatory tailwinds are going in the right direction. There's huge growth and all of the above. And then in terms of wanting to do something where I felt like I was really having purpose, right? It gets back to our earlier discussion of cannabis is still unfortunately viewed as the stigmatized industry, as, oh, you're investing in drugs, when in reality, the medicinal applications for this plant far exceed the quote unquote negative aspects associated with our traditional conception of drugs. Not to mention the fact that if you look at the impact of the war on drugs, particularly on communities of color and other economically disadvantaged communities, it's been a massive, massive drain on those communities. And so I really, over time, have enjoyed getting to learn the history of that and getting to do my small part in righting the wrongs of the past.
That's what you said just resonated, because in 2012, I was managing a small hedge fund, and there were some personal issues that was happening with the partners. His wife was terminally ill. And it was one of these like moments where, I had a really exciting, for a young professional, really exciting career path. And I didn't have this huge interest in cannabis necessarily, but I kind of wanted to do something that was like kind of off the beaten path. And I got this interview at Weed Maps, and I studied for like a week, to like learn as much as I could. And I think because there was some talk about they might start a fund, and I had a good track record, and I was like, oh, I'll manage it. I didn't have the knowledge, but I had the hubris to think I could. And they could tell, I didn't run a head shop or anything like that. They're like, why do you want to do this? And it was kind of like what you're saying. It's like, I want to be part of history. Like I want to change something. I mean, it is pretty cool when you can take investors' money and grow it, and you think, all right, now they have more choices, and I'm helping build businesses. But like, it's pretty hard to find a career where you can change the attitude people have towards a substance that's incarcerated way too many people. And not only that, Jordan, like there's a freedom element of it too, which I liked. And so it was kind of cool to just think there's this path out there for dorky white guys like me who want to make a difference. And I never thought, it would open up so many doors, but through that I met people like you. And I'll stop rambling, but I bring that up because it seems like there's a cohesion. Like I've worked in different aspects of the cannabis world, and gosh, I'd say like 90+% of the people I'll just cold call have been really cool. Like you were one, and your partner Pete was another. What has been your experience like, talking to competitors and just other stakeholders in the cannabis world?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. That's been one of my favorite parts of the industry as well, is to, especially early days, obviously as it continues to grow, it becomes more institutional and you get more of the traditional executives. But even earlier days, like the folks who are involved in cannabis, most of them not only saw the opportunity from an entrepreneur perspective, but they just are very passionate about the plans, very excited about it, very, very fun people, honestly, too, right? Like you don't get into cannabis if you're an uptight person, right? It's just certainly not the place for you. And it's funny, as you were talking about guitar and music earlier, that was probably my first introduction to cannabis, in the sense of it not being this horrible drug that you need to stay away from altogether. Right? I made a post on 420 about how important music is to me and to the cannabis industry as a whole, and cited Ben Harper's song "Burn One Down," which was one of the first times that you listen to the simplicity of those lyrics, right? Like, herb the gift from the earth, what's from the earth is of the greatest worth, right? If you don't like my fire, don't come around, right? It's like it's just so simple, but it's like there's almost no harm being done by this plant, Yet we've created this entire prison industrial complex as a result of the war on drugs to mass incarcerate mostly African Americans and Mexican folks, right? And it's just absolutely unjust. So I'm really excited to be a part of riding the ship and turning things around. I think, if anything, I wish things were happening faster, but some progress is better than none.
You and me both. Well, thank you for the Ben Harper reference. My wife and I shared our first dance as a married couple to a Ben Harper song. So it brings me.
Which one?
Forever.
Oh, that's a beautiful song.
Thank you. And I won't sing it because I want people to tune in to this podcast. But so you entered this crazy industry in 2017, and so for people who aren't as well versed as you are, that was a pretty exciting time. I mean, the Canadian licensed producers kind of were getting all the headlines. It became legal in Canada, with certain limitations. We don't have to get too specific, but please share with the hundreds of millions of viewers and listeners out there what the cannabis industry was like in 2017.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. So the idea started in 2017 and officially started in mid 2018. I think June is when we officially kicked off. And August of 2018 is when you saw Constellation Brands, which is one of the largest alcohol manufacturers in the world, invested 5 billion Canadian into canopy growth. I think in hindsight, it's widely viewed that was probably not the right valuation or dollar amount to invest at that time. But what you saw happen was just this absolute explosion of interest, right? The capital markets were very strong at that time. Capital was flooding the markets. It seemed like it was just this, total bonanza. Mm-hmm. Thankfully, we were still in the formation and strategy planning stage of the fund at that time. So we didn't really invest much capital in that time period, because fast forward to middle of 2019, when all these Canadian companies actually started to report earnings, they realized, whoa, we're not there yet. The valuation, the dollars that are coming in do not make sense, and everything really cratered. So unfortunately, a lot of folks who had put a lot of capital to work during that time period lost their shirts. And frankly, it continues to be a major drag on the industry today, right? Because a lot of the people who were putting capital to work at that time period, especially the institutions, have had such a difficulty getting out of that overinflated market that they've been very reluctant to put more capital to work in the meantime. So thankfully, we missed a lot of that and have been able to deploy most of our deals in much more constrained capital markets environments.
So you started this business at a time where there was irrational exuberance, for lack of a better word, where I remember like companies were trading at like 30 plus times earnings. Like it was ridiculous, but in a sense, it's cool to start your firm there. And then things are normalizing, earnings matter. We're not getting the same crazy multiple expansions we saw a few years ago, but then you're still tasked with finding money to put to work on behalf of your fund. And on one hand, from a value standpoint, it's so much better to invest now than it ever was. But on the other hand, there's not this crazy exuberance we saw a few years ago. Like what say you, Jordan, to that?
Yeah, it's a great point. Fundraising for us, just like for most cannabis operating companies, I'd say has probably been the biggest challenge, right? Because to everything you're saying right there, not many institutions in the space, many of the investors who got in early lost a lot of money. So finding capital has been difficult, but that's where we've been really fortunate to have built very strong networks of financial services professionals in our past lives, my partners and I, where I'd say where the vast majority of our capital came from for Fund One, where it's folks who understand private equity as an asset class, understand the capital constraint dynamics, understand the regulatory tailwinds behind cannabis, and we're willing to take a risk on some young guys in a Fund One. And so, I think that story, as we're now raising again, is going to continue to play out in a very similar structure. Continuing to see more family offices get interested in as well, which is great. But yeah, for the time being, it's really finding those pockets of capital where you can, with the thesis being that eventually, as you see stuff like safe banking and maybe US exchange access opening up to cannabis businesses, that'll really start to unlock the floodgates for institutional investors who want to get into cannabis. And then we'll just be very well positioned for those new investors.
Yeah, you just mentioned safe banking, and that's a very clear kind of tangible future catalyst. And you said a lot of important things. I think I want to highlight that in order to earn outsized returns, there has to be some challenges, and there has to be some future catalysts. And so on one hand, the lack of access to capital makes your job harder, but it can make the investor's returns that much sweeter.
Totally.
And how can I get more people to understand that point? Because that's something I talk with to my friends, but it seems like getting it out there is just a hard sell.
Yeah, no, you're preaching to the choir on that one. I think it just all comes down to folks really recognizing the fundamentals of these businesses. I think part of the problem too with the public companies in cannabis, specifically the ones in the US, is that because of the federal illegality, they're forced to list on minor exchanges up in Canada today.
Yeah.
So what that does is it cuts off even more institutional investor access. There's very limited liquidity for these public securities. There's very limited number of total investors, and the ones who are investing are predominantly retail investors who don't typically trade on fundamentals. It's much more based on kind of market noise, which I think is a big part of why you've seen such a big contraction this year. But again, that's to your point. That's why it's such a great buying opportunity. And I think even those public CSE listed companies today, you look at where they're trading to now, many of them are, about 1x revenue. And these are huge companies, 500 million plus in revenues. So I remain excited about the buying opportunity. Obviously finding the capital to deploy remains a challenge, but to your point, that's why the opportunity for outsized returns exists.
You sound like a younger and much better looking version of Warren Buffett. So I applaud you. I wanted to rewind just a little bit, Jordan, because on your LinkedIn, it mentions you have an econ and poli-sci degree at Indiana University. That's pretty standard fare for a lot of people in finance. However, it changes a bit because then you also have a degree in consciousness and human potential from Maharishi International University. What's the story there, Jordan?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I'm actually still enrolled in that program. It's about a semester in. Consciousness is an interest of mine that just started about a year ago, but it's one of those things that when it bites you, it's pretty fascinating. And so taking a step back, we currently live in a world where the consensus science paradigm, right, is very much of a reductionist mechanistic paradigm that says the entire universe, including the human body, works very much as a machine where we're all made up of parts, where there is no teleological purpose to the universe in a sense, right? But if you look at ancient civilizations of the past, including the Vedic tradition in India, the Egyptian philosophy, that wasn't always the case, right? And many of these ancient philosophies held what's now considered a panpsychist view, where consciousness itself is actually the underlying essence of everything in the universe through which we're all entangled. And so I was introduced to some metaphysical concepts, including what's known as the holographic universe, which was developed by physicist David Bohm, the unified field of consciousness, which was developed by string theorist John Hagelin and the like, and started to recognize that I actually think this is a much more accurate depiction of how the universe and the human physiology works. And once you start applying modern science to this panpsychist philosophy as opposed to reductionist philosophy, everything changes. The implications are incredibly profound, and that's why it's been such a fascinating area for me to explore.
Well, Jordan, I feel both smarter and dumber after hearing that. I'm very, very impressed. I was like, well, I got some homework to do now. When you were interviewing at GE, did anyone ask you about this? Or if you were interviewing there now, do you think you could use this to your advantage?
That's a great question. I think to your point, it's a little bit and I'm still working on explaining it in a way that actually makes sense. But this is all very recent for me. So I just started the program back in February. I think for me, consciousness is one of those things where the applications are endless, right? And the reason that my degree is consciousness and human potential is because I've come to believe that human potential is literally infinite, right? And so I think, again, we're kind of ingrained that human development is a little bit of a bell curve, right? Where you kind of peak around age 25, 30, and then it's all kind of downhill and degrading from there. But I've learned that I think if you understand the implications of consciousness, the implications of meditation, transcendental meditation is the practice taught at MIU, but there's all kinds of other deep meditation practices. They found that you can actually reverse the decaying of your IQ and kind of reaccelerate that. It has all kinds of profound implications for long-term health and that kind of thing. So it's, like I said, the implications of consciousness and developing that skill set are nothing but profound.
Wow. So you're on the forefront of so many important movements. I'm really impressed. We don't have a ton. I feel like I could chat with you for hours, so we'll have to have you back soon. You got into the cannabis industry largely, but I'd call it kind of activist pursuits. But you also have bills to pay. How do you balance that? Like when you're evaluating an investment, what one might, in your opinion, have greater, and it's kind of a buzzword, but social equity. I just kind of call it equity, but
Sure.
And another might have a clearer path to profitability for your investors. How do you weigh those two?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's definitely a challenge. I think that in general, the cannabis industry is very much of a social equity prerogative, right? Just in the sense of everything we're talking about in terms of turning things around. But look, there's so much more we could be doing, right? There's no doubt that just like most other industries, the industry has continued to favor consolidation. It's continued to favor folks who have access to large pockets of capital, and who has access to large pockets of capital, typically rich white men whose parents and grandparents also had access to lots of capital, right? And so states are working to do more for social equity licensures, but to your point, much more can be done. And I think that part of what I'm hoping for, not just cannabis, but I think for the economy more broadly, is that we get away from this historical view of capitalism as shareholder profits is the only measurement of success. That's where we need to focus, of this kind of Milton Friedman type view of the world of just growth, profit at all cost. And so that's also why I'm very excited about all the work that's being done in Silicon Valley and other places with crypto, where I think as we start to really understand the implications of decentralized finance, we can start to figure out ways to much more clearly align incentives between entrepreneurs, suppliers, and consumers. Because today, I think that equation has just gotten completely out of whack. So it's something I struggle with personally and professionally, but I'm optimistic that there's a lot of folks doing really great work and coming up with great ideas on how we can improve going forward.
They are. And I was listening to I think it was the Cannabis Investment Podcast, and a woman on there said, we have all these goals we want to achieve, but they're predicated on profits. Sometimes I think, and this could go for any kind of nascent industry, it's like, we want to see more people in this vertical, or we want to have more dreams achieved. How do you do that? You have money. And in order to have money, you need to be able to sell things for a price greater than your cost. And there are certain challenges, specifically taxation, and that this could be a whole different episode, where it's very esoteric to the cannabis world. I mean, if you were selling gum instead of weed, your profit margins would be different on at least in terms of the gross margin level. And so if I had one wish right now, and just one, it would probably be on the business side to get rid of 280E, like the taxation protocols on cannabis companies. What about you? Like if you could have one, two, just kind of big, somewhat realistic, but goals that you didn't have to go through Congress, sort of, you could just kind of snap your fingers and that would happen. What would they be, Jordan?
Yeah. It's a tough question. Obviously getting rid of 280E would be huge. And as you talk about, what's a realistic goal? I think safe banking this year, sometime soon, would be huge. Even safe banking, it's not necessarily going to be a huge change for operating in the cannabis industry, but if that's quickly followed up by an amendment that would allow for cap markets access and listing on major US exchanges, I think that would be great. Now, as I think more of like a utopian, idealistic goal, I think that we should overturn the Controlled Substances Act, right? I think it made absolutely no sense when it was put in place. It's created exponentially more harm than good. And you look at countries like Portugal that have gotten rid of it, what's happened? Mental illness has gone down, addiction's gone down. These people that are addicted to drugs, they're not criminals. They're people that are likely going through a very challenged part of their life and need help, right? They don't need to be put and locked away in a jail cell and isolated even further, treated as criminals, disenfranchised from having to vote. And then as we kind of talked about consciousness earlier, I think as psychedelics become legalized and people have the ability to take those in the right set and setting with the right skill set and understand what they're getting into, I think the implications of psychedelics being able to help unlock those human potentiality latent within all of us, again, the implications are so profound that we haven't even begun to scratch the surface.
Beautifully put. That reminds me, Jordan, of my favorite Onion headline. It says, "The war on drugs is over. Drugs win."
That's amazing.
So where can people learn more about you?
Yeah, so check out keyinvestmentpartners.com. That's our website. That's our cannabis, website. And then for me personally, as I've gotten more interested in consciousness and its implications, I actually a few months ago started a separate podcast called Entangled, which is all about exploring the science of consciousness, the true nature of reality, and what it means to be a spiritual being, having a human experience. So check that out if you're more into the kind of esoteric, wild stuff.
I say check them both out. Jordan, thank you so much. I hope you join us soon. And I really appreciate you being on the Matt Balaker podcast.
Absolutely, Matt. Thanks so much for having me. I had a blast.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Matt Balaker podcast. To learn more, please check out mattbalaker.com and encourage your friends to like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate it.